This here is a glass vase I got from IKEA, and I'm going to show you how to turn it into a beautiful terrarium ecosystem. As always, in a terrarium this size, I'm going to start off with the drainage layer. What I'll be using for this build is some fine aquarium gravel. It's cheap, easy to get hold of, and works well as a drainage layer. The purpose of this layer is to provide a place for excess water to sit instead of it sitting in the substrate. For a terrarium this size, you really don't need too much, and just a couple centimetres would do. Be sure that it's flat and even with no high or low points. Usually at this point I'd place on some window screen mesh to act as a substrate barrier. This will sit on top of the drainage layer and prevent substrate from getting down into it. But for this build it's not necessary at all. The small size of the gravel will make it really hard for any substrate to get through and essentially forms its own substrate barrier. If I was to use another drainage option such as pea gravel or leaker, then a substrate barrier should definitely be put in place. With the drainage complete, let's talk about the substrate. A quality substrate is a key factor in any successful terrarium, so it's important that you use a good mix. This here is my soil mix, which I've used for quite literally thousands of terrariums, and it hasn't let me down. After pouring in a generous amount, I'm using this terrarium tool, which is simply a stick with a cork in the end to gently pat everything down. You might notice that I have slightly sloped it up towards the back. This is a common technique to help improve the sense of depth inside the terrarium. Now it's time for the next step and my favourite, which is the hardscape. I've got this really cool piece of driftwood which I think will look great inside this ecosystem. I have experimented with its placement a little while off camera, so I know roughly where it's going to go. It's always good to try multiple layouts before settling on one. I'm really liking how it's looking, but there is a problem that needs to be addressed before moving on. The top of the driftwood is poking out the glass, which will cause a lot of problems later on. This is easily fixed by simply breaking off the top with some pliers. Now it fits perfectly inside. To add a bit more interest to the hardscape, I'm going to use these small stones to create a simple stepping stone path. I want them leading up to the hole in the driftwood, which does resemble some sort of cave or mini home. When creating a path, make sure the larger stones are towards the front, with them gradually getting smaller towards the back. This really helps improve the sense of depth. I'm loving how it's looking, so let's get to work bringing it to life with moss and plants. The moss I'll be using for this build is cushion moss. It's a beginner friendly species which is super easy to grow and take care of. I'm tearing it into small chunks and then trimming off the base with some scissors. This doesn't hurt the moss, but it does allow it to sit much closer to the substrate, which results in a better looking terrarium. If you can't get hold of cushion moss, there's plenty of other species that you can use, and if you wanted, you can even go out and collect your own moss. If you do decide to collect your own, just make sure you do it responsibly and only take what you need. Whilst I finish up planting this moss, I should mention that I do have a beginner terrarium ebook which is perfect for anyone new to terrarium making. It covers everything you need to know about making and caring for terrariums, and will definitely help you avoid some unfortunate beginner mistakes. If you're interested, it'll be at the top of the description and in the pinned comment. Now the moss is in, the ecosystem is really starting to take shape and come to life. I've got some small stones which I think will add a nice bit of detail to the scape. I'm simply placing a few on top of the moss throughout the terrarium. Ideally, I don't want the moss to be drying out, so I'm giving it a light spray down every now and then. Now it's time to add some plants. I've got some small Anubias and bucephlamdra which I think will look nice growing on the driftwood. These plants are epiphytes, so all I've got to do is wedge them inside gaps and cracks. I feel like the terrarium's lacking some colour, but this Fittonia should solve that problem. I'm taking a few cuttings from this plant that I propagated myself. I'll be planting the stem down into the moss up to the first set of leaves, and they'll send out their own roots in no time. The high humidity environment of the terrarium provides perfect conditions for these plants to root and grow. This here is a bolbitis fern. Just like the Anubias and bucephlamdra, it's an aquatic plant that thrives in terrarium conditions. To plant it, all I'm doing is wedging it in behind the driftwood. I really like how it appears to look like it's growing out the top of the driftwood. The stepping stone path really isn't popping out like I hoped it would, so I'm going to replace the pebbles with some small stones. Terrarium making is all about trial and error, so don't be discouraged to make changes and try new things. I'm going to replace them with some of the same rocks that I used throughout the scape. Once again, I'm making sure that they get smaller and smaller as they go. I'm not 100% set on this change, but I do think they look better than the old stones. I do want to hear your opinion, so let me know in the comments. These here are some small twigs and branches. I'm going to place them around the driftwood to add some more detail to the scape. These are small spiderwood branches, but you can definitely use small twigs that you found outside. In my opinion, it looks so much better with these detail sticks added, and it truly looks like a slice of nature. Now it's time for one of the most important steps, and that's the springtails. These tiny bugs will feed on things like mould and decaying matter throughout the ecosystem. As I used a lot of wood in this scape, I'm almost certain that there's going to be a mould outbreak in the first couple weeks. This is completely normal, but the springtails will help keep it to a minimum. Now it's time to water the terrarium. I'm going to use a pipette, but a small spray bottle works just as well. The biggest mistake I see people make with terrariums is overwatering. The way I know if I've watered enough is by looking at the moss and substrate. If it's looking dry, then it's going to need some more water. Only water until the moss and substrate are damp. You don't want them to be wet or soggy. As you've probably noticed, this terrarium currently doesn't have a lid, and left as it is, that's going to be a big problem. This here is a clear acrylic disc, and it makes a perfect terrarium lid. Without a lid like this one, the plants inside the terrarium would dry up and die in no time at all. I really hope you enjoyed this video and maybe even learned a thing or two. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future builds or updates, and thank you for watching.